Welcome to the EdTech Throwdown. Join us, Eric Geis and Nick Johnson, as we dive into today's best EdTech tools, tips, and practices. We do the research so you can teach your class. Remember to follow us on social media like Instagram, X, or Facebook by looking for the handle at EdTech Throwdown. Now please enjoy the show.
Welcome to the EdTech Throwdown. This is episode 213 called Designing Lessons Based on Cognitive Science with Dave Snyder. In this episode, we'll talk with Mr. Dave Snyder about current research in cognitive science and how it has shaped his lessons and the overall classroom experience for his students and their learning. This is another episode you don't want to miss. Check it out. In today's episode, we are talking to Dean of Academics at Seton Hall Prep in West Orange, New Jersey, Mr. Dave Snyder. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today, my friend?
Doing great, Nick, and I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity to speak. Pleasure to meet you guys at NJECC, and pleasure to be on this podcast.
Yeah, the pleasure is all ours. I'll get more into that once we talk about kind of why you're here today, but I'm probably more excited than you are for this, as everybody listening is soon to find out. Before we get to any of that good stuff, would you mind just kind of giving all the listeners a quick pitch about the Dave Snyder hero's origin story, as it were, like your own education, your own teaching experience, and a little bit about what it is you do now?
Hero's origin story, I'm not so sure about that, but I do think the teachers are heroes, so in that regard, it's appropriate. But I've been teaching for 31 years, also teaching many of the sciences at our school. I was a science chair for many years, but also a soccer coach. And I think that I've been coaching at the youth level and coaching at Seton Hall Prep as well. And I try to take the same things that I've just learned over the past 2 to 3 years, and I want to apply them to soccer. And I've seen the results there, and apply them also to the classroom, and then hopefully spread them to whatever teachers want to hear about them. Because I just look at this in quick summary. I just look at this as though, maybe 28 or 29 years of my career, had I known what these professionals and researchers I've learned from over the past few years, that would have really just dramatically changed my students' lives, my lives, the rewardingness of being the reward of being a teacher. So right now, in quick summary, I'm probably enjoying teaching right now in my 31st year more than I ever have, because of what I've learned from these experts.
That's one of the things I remember from your presentation, is you shared that with the group of us that were listening to you. Maybe that's a good place for us to explain to everybody like why you're here. So I'll do this. This is where I come in, because I, in particular, was, I don't know if moved is the right word, but man, what you were saying spoke to me so much at this conference, and that's essentially why Dave is here. So I'm going to start off with that. Geis and I, for our regular listeners too, we're missing a voice. That's because Geis had to call out today, but we decided to go forward with the interview, so it's just the two of us. But this whole thing began at a conference, one of our favorite conferences of the year, NJECC, or NJECC, as you called it at the start. Dave, you actually reached out to us, Geis and I, in advance to kind of just say like, hey, what's up? I'd be interested if you guys could come by our session. We said sure, because we never know what sessions to attend anyway. And we did. We sat into the session. Do you remember what was the actual name? It was like Tech or No Tech or something, right?
Tech or No Tech, how the brain works and how we learn and how we can teach to that. Something along those lines.
Okay, that's what I thought, which appealed to me, because that's something I wrestle with a lot. It's just in my classroom as a teacher, is like, when do I actually want to bring in technology? And I want to circle back to that in the end too. But we were sitting there and you were going through your introduction, and I'm listening, and so much of what you were saying, it's started to resonate with the experience that I've been having as a teacher over the past decade, in particular as a science teacher. And I can be specific with the listeners, like with some things that I mean. So for me, having mixed results with, like, let's say a cooperative learning lesson where I put some thing together for my students to learn the information on their own, because I've been told that that's the best way to have people learn stuff. This is a good example. Another one for science specifically is inquiry-based lessons where students try to, answer a question basically. And I do a lot of that, and sometimes it's great, but a lot of the time I end with mixed results where I feel like I don't even know who got anything out of this besides like the 4 to 5 smartest kids in the room. And for everybody listening, Dave is there shaking his head right now because these, and maybe if you're a listener, you're doing the same thing. And I thought of too, like I've tried jigsaws in the past where the kids become the experts and then they teach each other as everybody rotates around. And I've tried that. And like sometimes it's great, but a lot of the times I'm listening to the kids try to be the experts and they're just not, because they're students learning info for the first time. And it kind of falls flat for that reason. And as somebody in the classroom who's had all these experiences, most of the time I just feel like I'm doing a bad job. Like I don't know how to run a jigsaw, or I don't know how to do inquiry-based learning very well. And that has felt bad to me. You know what I mean? Like I feel like I'm deficient in some way and I just need more practice to advance to this level. And listening to your presentation is sort of, I don't know if vindicated is the right word, because it makes me sound like I'm a teacher who wants to remain stagnant and not grow, which is false. But it just made me feel like somebody else out there has had that experience and is saying that there might be a reason for it. Could you just kind of comment generally on that feeling and some of the stuff that you shared?
Sure, but really quickly, full disclosure, you guys had no idea who I was. I'm not, an expert or well-known in the field. And I had reached out to you guys because the respect that I have you guys for your podcast. And when you give those sessions at NJECC, that's one of the main reasons I go there every year, is that you guys do such a great job. So then I reached out to you guys to see if you'd be willing to come to my session, because I hold you guys up there on a pedestal and I really wanted your opinion. So the fact that you guys got something out of it that day, I look to you guys as role models, as educators. So that was really helpful. When I saw you guys in the session, I'm like, all right, here we go.
Thanks, Dave.
But it really hits a lot, and I think it's hitting a lot for teachers in this country. So quick background, in a lot of countries in Europe, England especially, about 80% of the teachers there are aware of what the research is of cognitive science. In this country, the research is almost the exact opposite. It's about 20% of the teachers in this country are aware of the concepts of cognitive science and how that impacts the classroom. So there really needs to be a lot more word spread in this country. And that's literally why I gave that session. I had learned so much from wonderful experts who had volunteered their time or read books or were guests on podcasts. And I kind of had an explosion in my brain about 2.5 years ago. I think it all started with a post on X/Twitter by Carl Hendrick talking about how learning styles are really learning preferences, and they really sort of don't exist. We should not, as teachers, be trying to come up with a lesson that has the learning style of this person and the learning style of that person and the learning style of this person in our lessons. So that opened up a whole Pandora's box for me, and I started reading like crazy, and I said, I got to know a lot more about this. And when I did that, I then had to put together a list of resources for teachers at our school or for anybody else. What's going to happen to your brain when you start really appreciating this? So going back to your point, I've been teaching now, I think this is my 31st year. And for my first 28, I didn't know any of this. I was trying my hardest to be the best teacher I possibly could. I wanted my classroom to be, a comfortable room. I wanted it to have guardrails. So obviously behavior had to be top quality, But in the same regard, I wanted my students loving whatever science I was teaching, that your physical science, chemistry, biology, whatever. And I just wanted them to love the course. I wanted them to get a lot out of it. I wanted to be a challenging teacher, but I wanted them to know a lot by the end of the year. And then each year I'd be like, I don't know if I did an awesome job or not. And now what I have with all of this research on cognitive science, I can now evaluate myself and even ask my peers to evaluate me based on very concrete things. So for example, you mentioned, doing group work and maybe an inquiry-based lesson. And by the way, ultimately, that is the goal, right? We want our students to be incredibly creative. We want them to remember, we have this hope as teachers that we want our students to remember our course content 20 years from now. I don't know how realistic that is, and how realistic that is compared to how I was as a teacher, but that's really the goal. We want the students to at least fall in love with learning as well. So as a quick example, you mentioned, group work, and just to shed some light on that, imagine if you had, let's say, a group of 4, all right, and you have, let's say, one student's a little bit outspoken, one student is maybe not as outspoken, and 2 students maybe don't even want to be there, right? Or they might want to be there, but they really didn't understand the task well, or they still don't understand the material that well. You're now, by doing that group work, which is, again, could ultimately be the goal in the long run, to get them to think creatively and collaboratively, that's incredibly powerful. But a novice in that situation, you're actually advantaging, that's a fake word, giving the advantage to the advantaged, right? So the students who maybe had a very quality education growing up and had incredible parents and they're very strong in who they are, you're giving the advantage already to the student who is advantaged. And you're basically throwing a disadvantage at the student in that group who maybe didn't have a great education growing up, maybe doesn't have great self-confidence. And they're now, one of the things I learned from one of the Dan Willingham book, Why Students Don't Like School, is that you put somebody in that environment and they might take a back seat and they might actually, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, start disliking school because they're in a situation where they don't feel that they could thrive. And I looked at all that and I'm like, what have I been doing for so many years by putting students in groups? And you really never know, which, by the way, I'll catch my breath in a second, but even things like checking for understanding. If somebody walked by my classroom a few years ago and saw this great group work going on, so, what looks like great group work, they'd be like, wow, this teacher's really doing a great job. These students are discussing things. They look like they're engaged in the material. And until they get to the next quiz or the next test, I didn't really know who was getting it or who wasn't getting it, right? So some of the different techniques that are in a million of these resources that I've been looking at, especially like Doug Lemov's books and things like that, checking for understanding, whether it's using whiteboards, getting, cold calling, all these various techniques. I now enjoy teaching more because at the end of a period, I now know so much better what my students are grasping and what they're not grasping. So when the end of the period takes place, I'm like, "Oh, Dave, how did you do?" And I can judge myself based on what actually I did in that classroom. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but when that really opened up my eyes to the different techniques and what students could be going through, it then started a whole waterfall of research. And now I just feel like I'm such a rookie. I do not look at myself like I'm an expert in this field, but what I'm learning and getting from workshops and books and podcasts, I just want to share with other people, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and that's why you're here today. That's why we wanted to have you here to do some of that. And, the takeaway is, I think, 2 things. One, we're going to share some of this cognitive science information that you referenced and get into some specifics for the listeners. Number 2, because we're still just kind of starting off here, if anything we've said has resonated with anybody listening, right? So some of the experiences I shared, some of the experiences Dave shared, then this is an episode for you. And I have a strong feeling that that's going to be most, if not all, the listeners. We have to pause for a word from the Teach Better Podcast Network, of course. And when we come back, we're going to get into some of the details of cognitive science and like specifically what this can mean for you, your classroom, and ultimately the goal is, as always, is helping your students learn better.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Okay, so we are back, and I want to begin the main interview segment here by referencing one of the ways that you started off your session that we watched you with, Dave, which was, I believe it was a survey question where you asked the group what most affects, or like what we thought most affected a student's ability to learn. And I think it might have been learn science, but let's just make it to learn. And you listed 5 things. I have those here. One of them was, and for the listeners, you can play along, right? The first one was what they already know. The second one was how motivated they are. The third one, their learning style. The fourth one, how interesting the material is. And the fifth one, how much inquiry-based instruction they have. And those were the 5 choices, and you kind of let everybody respond. I answered the way I thought I was supposed to, which is number 5, because I assumed, as someone who goes to a lot of conferences, it's like, it's always inquiry, right? Inquiry is the way you teach, and that's how you should be instructing. I'll let you take it from here, but spoiler alert, number 5, I don't believe was the answer. Could you let everybody know what was the research-backed response here?
Yes. So I full disclosure, if you share this link, remember this link to the PowerPoint presentation, if you share that in the show notes, people could see more about what experts I'm quoting here, because that is definitely not my own question. I stole that from wonderful expert Dylan William. And it says of the following options, because one of the things that was basically your financial background, your economic status. But the answer was number 1, what the students already know. And unless we have a good handle on what students already know, getting them to learn science is going to be, I hate to use the expression, spitting into the wind, but it's going to be like, pouring a bucket from one pool and dumping it into the deep end and hoping that's going to make any kind of change. But it's really based on the knowledge that they have already, which really sets the stage for us as teachers during a school year, right? If students forgot what they learned early in the year, it's not the end of the world. We'll probably come to that later on in the conversation. It's not the end of the world, but if they truly forgot and it's not really accessible in the brain, then you teaching a new section of material might be almost a complete waste of time. And so what they already know is critical to what somebody can learn.
And does that, I mean, like in my mind, if we, like, how does that relate to, we've been talking about group work, right? Where like maybe that's beneficial for some of the kids, but not all. And it might look really good to say like an administrator passing through the room, they might see like, oh, this is a fantastic lesson. All the kids are in groups. They're helping each other out. There's chatter. There's things happening. But is that really the case? And like maybe all those students didn't all know the same thing at the beginning of that group work. How does that play into that type of a scenario?
Yeah. So some students, they're not educators yet, the students, right? So they don't know that it's critical to already have foundational material before you could take the next step. So they're not going to go around the small group and realize, oh, Peter, I didn't realize you didn't know this material already. Did you know that that's important for your brain to understand?
Right.
So they're not educators. Yes, they are talking together. And by the way, when it comes to like test preparation and studying for a quiz, it's absolutely invaluable that we encourage, whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom, it's invaluable that these students are quizzing each other. I'll talk about Robert Bjork maybe a little bit later and the importance of retrieval practice, but it really is important that these students are communicating with each other. But when they're first learning material and they don't really know it that well, you coming up with a cool activity about, well, let's say we had a mission to Mars. What would we need based on what we learned in my science class? That might just be a very frustrating activity for a couple of those students. And if they don't know the requisite content ahead of time, they're sitting in your class, they're looking out the window, they're daydreaming, but as a teacher, you have no idea, what's going on in that classroom because they're in this inquiry-based environment. And to be honest with you, I know I'm beating myself up a little bit here, but I look at, 28 years of my career, and I would have had very loose interpretation of how well my students in group work were really learning material. To me, everything that I learned at workshops and classes, you name it, was about getting them into groups and having them really work together. And I believe the inspiration, at least in science, came when we tried to first land somebody on the moon. Schools saw that scientists were working in groups, and if we're going to win the space race, we need our students to work in groups. But it's critical that teachers realize and administrators realize that novices don't learn, they don't process material the same way that experts do, right? And almost the more expert you are in the field, the more you have to know about how the brain works. It's a real quick example of that. And I hope I'm not taking too much time on that.
No, take it away. This is the gold, and this is the thing that really sold me originally. So I'm glad you're going there.
So when a novice is learning something, they don't have what's called schema. All right. So I've seen your sessions before, Nick. I know that you're an expert chemistry teacher. I also know that you're an expert at integrating technology into your classroom. So for example, if a new technology came around and it had a relevance for the science classroom, your brain would process that much differently than a really good chemistry teacher who is not tech savvy. You don't just pick it up faster. What you have is schema. So almost imagine that your brain has, in a way, the ability to make connections with all the material that you have placed in your brain. And you can make those connections not just much more quickly, but you can make connections that other people flat out can't do, right? So one of the only problems with a truly expert in a field who is then a teacher is they can't really relate as much. If they don't know this already about how the brain works, they can't really relate to students not being able to process information the same way that they can. Whether you're an expert baseball coach, soccer coach, whether you're teaching somebody how to cook. My wife is a wizard in the kitchen, right? And if she learns something with a new recipe, she processes it no problem because she's got that schema in her brain, right? But a novice simply can't do that. And when a teacher can appreciate that the student brain, any novice, by the way, not just our student, not just the students in front of us, but anybody who's a novice, you don't have schema. So I went to a workshop once where they kept talking about, we need our students to be creative. We don't need students to know things any longer because that's at their fingertips. They could just search for it online. And what cognitive science is saying, this is not a Dave Snyderism, but what cognitive science is saying is that that's completely rubbish, that you need to know things in order to be creative. At our school, we have an outstanding art teacher. And instead of him just trying to get the students to harness their creativity and take chances and take risks and really see what you get, he teaches them the basics and the concepts, and he does a phenomenal job. He can take a student drawing stick figures and having them do incredible work by the end of the year. But my point behind that is when you don't have schema in your brain, you can't just force creativity. You can't just tell a soccer player, really be creative today and go out there and give it what you got and, experiment and have fun. Experimenting and having fun is awesome. And making mistakes is actually critical to education. But my closing point behind that one is that if we can appreciate what schema is and appreciate where the student brain is, we need to help them make those connections. And we can't expect them to work collaboratively in a group or to solve even an independent project on their own without helping first build that schema. So
the schema thing is really, I think, should be, at least for me, it was like the mind blower. And I'm going to try to give the listeners another example of an experience that they've probably had. Maybe 8 years ago, I went to a session at a local university near us, and it was all about inquiry-based learning, and it was kind of walking teachers in attendance through this framework that they could use in their classrooms. And it was supposed to be inquiry-based. You're not really giving the kids any information. They are discovering it themselves, and this is going to be amazing. And indeed, when all of us, the teachers in the room, who already have decades of schema on these concepts, when we went through these lessons, and these were math lessons. This was on, I think they were all fraction-based, ways that an elementary school teacher could teach fractions using inquiry-based learning. We were doing these inquiry lessons, and we were like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like, I understand fractions so much better now. We need to make our students have this same experience, because if our kids could just do that same lesson, then they would be in the same place we are in understanding fractions at this extremely deep level. And teachers, rightfully so, I think, with their hearts in the right place, are like, let's bring this to the classroom. This is amazing. But we do so without ever acknowledging that the experience we have doing that lesson is very different from the experience a novice would have in doing that same thing. And in fact, maybe it is not as great for a novice because they don't have that schema in place. So maybe you're confusing them more. Or in the art example, how do you expect a high level of creativity without first giving the basics? And I think we sort of need to acknowledge that. And you tell me, like, is that what you're saying? Is that correct?
Hit the nail on the head. I guess I also look at it with the word maybe efficiency, right? So I think all really good teachers have been through something in their lives where they've discovered something on their own and it stayed with them for the rest of their lives and it felt special, right? And I think when we remember that, that's what those good intention workshops were all about. They're like, if we can get students to experience this on their own and discover it on their own, that is wonderful. And yes, by the way, that is great.
It is great.
Think about the lack of efficiency in that. You know, depending on the size of your classroom, maybe a small classroom has 15 kids, maybe a large classroom may have up to 30 kids, right, in it. And it's not efficient to go through and really make sure that we're educating students on that much larger scale. When we're doing something like that, it might take way too long. So building that schema first, right, is going to eventually help lead to, I know I sound redundant, but lead to that path that we all want. We would love that group work. We would love that discovery learning to take place, but we really can't do that until we build the schema first.
So that was, when I was sitting there listening to you, it just felt so validating for me to hear that, because I was like, yes, this perfectly explains why I've had these feelings. Try to do inquiry lessons for chemistry novices. And maybe I'll go back to that shared going through those fraction lessons. That university asked me to come back for another session and be a presenter, because they wanted someone to develop some high school science lessons using the same framework that they taught. And I was like, yes, I'm all in. This is fantastic. I loved it. And I came back to present a high school version of these inquiry lessons in chemistry. And I tried to do it, Dave, and it was the worst session I've ever presented, because the teachers in the room were novices. They were not high school science teachers. They weren't chemistry teachers. And it was honestly embarrassing. And that university never asked me to do it again. because it was bad. And I felt like a failure. I was like, I guess I just am not good at doing inquiry-based learning. But these people, like my students, they didn't have the schema for reaction rates. They don't have the background. So to throw them into this, it just is harder to do. And totally different than the fraction one, because everybody in that room already knows a lot about fractions. Nobody knew about rates of chemical reactions, and it fell flat. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to acknowledge here. And before we move on, because there's at least two other things I want to hit, and there's like 1,000 things we could talk about.
Yeah.
You mentioned efficiency as well, something else that a lot of teachers don't hear from admin. We hear a lot about should be doing student-centered learning, should be doing inquiry, should be doing personalized learning, all these things. But I never hear somebody mention the inefficiency of those things. And I hope there's a listener, at least a handful right now, saying like, yes, thank you for acknowledging the inefficiency of these items, besides the fact that they can take a really long time. And add on to that, maybe the low quality of what at least some of the students get out of it. It just takes a long time. It's very slow and inefficient.
Without a doubt. And one of the things I wanted to mention about that is that when you were running that session that you said at the local university, if somebody had observed that, I think this is really critical for administrators, supervisors as well, is that if somebody walked by that session, Nick, you might have known that it might have not been going well, but if somebody just walked by for 2 minutes, it might have seemed like all these professionals are getting together trying to solve chemistry problems, right? And it might have looked wonderful. When you get this sort of arsenal of really powerful tools that you can use in the classroom, supervising becomes so much more collaborative and effective, and which I was a science supervisor for about a dozen years. And when you go into a classroom, you know when a teacher's doing a good job. You know when you have an expert, and you know when they're, really killing it. But in the same regard, many of your observations might be a little bit subjective. But when you know a lot about cognitive science, everything becomes that much more concrete. Crazy stat, right? So one of the things everybody should be researching, checking for understanding, whether it's Doug Lemov's work on checking for understanding, but checking for understanding could be using whiteboards, could be cold calling, a whole bunch of different things. But here's the deal when it comes to supervising, that let's say a teacher just says to their supervisor, I would love it if you could walk into my classroom and let me know how long a student could go without me knowing what's going on in their brain, right? So for example, let's say in that session that we had at Montclair State at NJECC, I don't know if you guys realized it, but I was frequently asking you guys questions and having you guys, and I could assess the whole class because it was either raising hands through 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 on a multiple choice question, or I had you write something on a whiteboard. So I was using techniques in that session. And now imagine a supervisor who was watching you at that university setting might say, I think Nick did a pretty good job, right? But in reality, as you said yourself, it wasn't so good. But now imagine a supervisor has something more concrete to look at, and the teacher wants them to say, hey, how many minutes could a student go through my class without thinking? And to be honest with you, Nick, this is where, again, I know I'm beating myself up. I guarantee you there were countless classes in my 31-year career where there might have been a class where a student could have gone through and maybe didn't think the entire period.
Right.
Because I didn't use checking for understanding techniques. So this is critical for supervisors, obviously, to learn about this because it's going to make their jobs so much more productive. They're going to impact the teachers' lives. Obviously, the whole goal is to impact students' lives. And so this also has huge impacts for the classroom when it comes to supervisory roles.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's just such a common sense thing to me, like, yeah, check for understanding. But it's just important to acknowledge that these things are real and research backed and cognitive science backed. There's two other things I want to get to before we wrap it up because we're running out of time. And if we're talking cognitive science, it would be crazy if I didn't mention at least this one other thing. This goes to one of the other little games that you played in the session. This one was, you said to the group, let's see, you wanted us to try to, without a pencil, so just using your brain only, try to place the days of the week in alphabetical order. And if you're listening to this and you're like driving, obviously be careful, but you could pause to try to do it. You gave everybody 20 seconds to try. I'm horrendous at this type of thing. Geis, weirdly, is phenomenal. So he had this done in like 10 seconds. If you've tried it, the proper order is Friday, Monday, Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday. And I'm reading that, not doing it. But there, okay, so everybody did that. And then you had us do it again, but this time with the months of the year. And this was like way harder. And the point of that progression was like, even those of you that did the days of the week, now when there are 12 months to place, how like exponentially harder that becomes. Can you talk about sort of the purpose of that and how that fits in with cognitive science?
If anything has been important in this podcast so far, that's wonderful. I think you just hit on the most transformational aspect of my career, and that is the limits of working memory. If there's anything that any teacher gets out of this podcast, it is the limits of working memory, not just for high school students, but for adults. So this I got from a Learning in the Brain conference last year in New York City. It was done by a session by Jim Heal and Meg Lee, and they walked us through, they tried to illustrate to the teachers in the audience how pathetically, almost humorous, right, our working memory is, right? So research had been done, and I can't remember who it was right now. I really should. It's embarrassing, but when we think of when we were growing up, maybe a lot of our phone numbers were 7 digits, and now they're 10, right? Well, the reason that it was 7 digits is because that's the limit of the working memory, is that it's very difficult to remember anything beyond 7. In fact, some research points it's more like it's more like 4. All right. So this was critical for my classroom, because here I was, as one of the courses that I taught was chemistry. And here I am teaching about, let's say, chemical reactions, but then I'm doing the stoichiometry part of it, which involves math. Can you imagine if a student who maybe doesn't really fully understand both of those, you are overloading their working memory. If we can't alphabetize in our brain the 7 days of the week, and by the way, many people can. I actually, during that session, I got one wrong. Many people can, do that in 20 seconds. If you're using paper, that's not the point, right? You have to do that one in your brain. So it made me realize, what am I doing in the classroom? If I'm not teaching to their working memory, then what happened to that 50-minute period that I just had with the students? It might have been a complete waste. It might have gone completely over their heads, other than for the 3 students or 4 students, you know what I'm talking about, the cluster of students that you can always count on to answer all your questions, to make you feel like you did a good job as a teacher by the end of that class period. So the working memory and the limits of working memory are critical, that every teacher can appreciate that. So what Meg Lee and Jim Heal did that day was they then had us alphabetize in our brain the months of the year. And out of all the people that could get the days of the week, almost nobody got the months of the year, right? We're not talking about months that nobody's ever heard of before. We're talking in the English language, right? Things that we all have known throughout our whole lives, and we couldn't do those. And so the point is, our working memory is almost comedically small. Our long-term memory, the research shows that it's so vast, scientists don't even know the limits of it yet. But our working memory, very concrete, it's pathetic. And as a teacher, when you go into a class and you don't take that into account, then your time period that you have with your students, for many of them, might actually be almost a complete waste. And that made me feel so frustrated about my career, because I learned about this so late in my career. I just wish I had an appreciation for it very early.
Yeah, for sure. But that's another very powerful thing to know and hear, as teachers engage in like good lesson design. We're not going to have time to explore this one fully, but I just want to mention it. You showed this schematic that's relatively well known, and probably most people who've gone through like formal education training have seen it before, but for me, it had been a while, so I wanted to mention it again for the listeners. You showed us some examples of forgetting curves, which is like the amount of time, or like as time passes, the quantity of information where students remember what you've said. And it's a very steep drop off, right? Like over, I don't know, whatever the days are, they've forgotten half of everything you've said. And then when those same amount of days pass again, they've forgotten almost everything. But every time they hear that information again, so when you review the things or when they engage with that content, the curve is less steep, right? It flattens off. So like, just to emphasize for us, the lesson designers, the power of, multiple engagements with that material and how beneficial that can be. And obviously there's a lot to go into there, but there's one thing that I want to end with, and this may be the most critical thing of the of the whole podcast. It's possible there's a listener right now screaming at their speaker saying, "What's wrong with you guys? You are bashing the past 20, 30 years of educational research saying that inquiry is bad. Student-centered learning is bad. Cooperative learning doesn't work." Some people might even think we're saying that we're going back to, this demonized version of teaching, like the sage on the stage, and the teacher should get up there and lecture. Is that what you're saying? Or is it not?
Not at all.
How does it
Not at all.
How does this all fit in?
Ultimately, the goal is, as we said a few times, we need our students to think creatively. We need to give them, the research on cognitive science shows that it actually gives these different techniques that hopefully your listeners will then, really jump into. These techniques build student confidence. And let's be honest, if you're a coach of a sport or a teacher, there's nothing more, enjoyable to watch than a student who's confident with material, right? And so these techniques build confidence, whereas putting students in group works before they're ready for them might actually erode confidence. And that's the last thing that we want. So having students, if students understand, by the way, I think teaching students the forgetting curve, for example, I think that's really helpful for them, because students are going to beat the heck out of themselves. I can't believe we did this yesterday and I forgot it already. No, it's not you. That's the way the brain works. Right. I think it was Ebbinghaus who first came up with this, but the forgetting is a part of learning. So when I was a coach, also, I'd be like, guys, we just did this yesterday. I can't believe we literally just did this yesterday. Well, the forgetting curve and bringing it back into your memory makes that memory stronger. That's research with Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork. But when you can remember something that you've forgotten, as long as you did remember, as long as you did learn it at one point, right? That makes the memory even stronger. And I won't belabor this point at all, but one of the things that Dylan Williams has pointed out is that it's not exactly like a computer where you can take things off of a hard drive. It's actually, in some regards, better than that. When we remember something and come back to it, it actually makes that memory stronger. And that doesn't happen in a computer, right? It gets used or not used. And every time we use a memory, we make it stronger. So we want our students, we want our teachers and administrators to do a lot of research on what's called retrieval practice. We want students quizzing each other. We want teachers revisiting material, maybe not just the next day, but maybe several weeks, maybe space out that retrieval, and then be forgiving with the students when they forget, because that's the nature of the beast. And when they forget, they're showing that that's actually critical to the learning process, is the forgetting, but then bringing it back makes it, the language that a lot of them are using is stickier, right? We all want our content to be sticky, right? And when we forget something and then we review it in a timely fashion, spreading it out, it then comes back to the brain and it stays there longer.
Dude, you should have seen, I teach AP Chem as one of my courses. And so right now we're prepping for the AP exam hard, because we're recording this in like mid-April, right? So that's what it's all about for all the AP classes out there. I showed my kids the forgetting curve and used that phrase from you. So thank you, by the way, telling them that forgetting is a part of learning. I felt like some of these kids were going to start crying. They felt so seen or the weight off their shoulders, because it was like, for them, they feel like a failure because they don't remember all these minutia details, that an exam like the AP exam will pull out from like September. Remember, I said that one little random fact on that one day, and then you never engage with it again. Come on, guys, how can you not remember that? And they carry around all this like guilt with them, like, what's wrong with me? And like the fact that somebody was telling them, no, actually, that's normal, and that's the way your brain works. And also, every single time you see that from here on out, and that's why we're reviewing before the AP exam, that's why you study, and maybe you have to see something over and over and over again. That's how it's supposed to work. It was like, for some of them, their brains exploded. Thank you for making me feel okay about this thing that I thought I was just like dumb in the past. It was awesome.
That's such an awesome story. Won't elaborate much on that at all. It's just that once the students are aware of this, right, it really can put a lot. It's going to change their study habits. It just makes them feel more confident, which is what we want in our students. We want students that feel more effective about their education, right? And by giving them these skills and tools, they're at least going to appreciate why they forgot something. They're at least going to appreciate the limits of maybe working memory, right? And when our students know about this, it's tremendously helpful. And one of the things that I would, really encourage the listeners to do is, once they're going to realize that this is just the smallest fraction. What we discussed today is just the smallest fraction of what could be like an ongoing multi-part series. And so much of what we talked about, what I love about it, is that it could be immediately applied tomorrow in class.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, this isn't just educational theory. It's like, oh, I realize that now, for example, I need to check for understanding. Dylan Williams says that maybe every, you're not going to believe this, 2 minutes. 2 minutes. And it's not, by the way, really quickly, Nick, and I'll let you go. I don't ask my students to hold their hands up anymore in class.
Okay.
Right? Because I want them to know that whatever I'm going to do to check for their understanding, it's either going to be on a whiteboard, or it's going to be by the show of fingers, with a multiple choice option. It could be with a Kahoot. All right. It could be, with technology, but I know, or it could be a cold call. All right. Or it could be think, pair, share, where they're going to think about the question, really deliberately write it down, share with one person, and then I cold call on somebody. My point is, when you do that type of behavior, the students who are constantly answering the questions in class can't be relied on anymore. And then now you have hopefully 100% of your class thinking about your class instead of the elite performers in that class. So my point is that when teachers start researching this, they're like, oh my God, I can apply this stuff tomorrow. I could apply it to my next period.
Yeah, I mean, the low prep aspect of a lot of what this is telling teachers they should be doing is phenomenal. I would almost say, let's leave technology out of it, because like, if you're talking about Kahoot, yeah, that has value, but that's more time investment for me, because I got to go there and I got to make it. Let's stick with the cold calling and the check for understanding that happens 2 minutes at the end of class, and it takes like no effort at all. Whereas for me to design an inquiry-based lesson that works really well, I mean, I would have to spend hours and hours and hours developing, working that. Not that it's wrong, as you said, we're not bashing those things, but place them in a smarter way and consider the schema that your students have. We got to wrap it up, and I'm bummed because there's so much to go into. We almost need like a side podcast series about cognitive science, I think, at this point, but we'll leave it there. Just for the listeners who are also maybe having a moment like Geist and I did, and like you did, some resources, and I've been scribbling stuff down as you've been talking. So tell me which names I get wrong or right. I'll let you kind of wrap it up. But we got Greg Ashman, Zach Brockle, I'm not really sure, Doug Lamov. You mentioned a book called Just Tell Them as something for people to check out. Did I get those right or wrong?
Yep. And if they really started with anything, one of the things that opened this up was Dan Willingham's book, Why Students Don't Like School. And Doug Lamov's work is great, because you almost have everything that you need in there. Carl Hendrick, Paul Kirshner. What I'll say is, if anybody forgets this, I don't know if you want to provide my PowerPoint presentation in show notes. I don't know if you're able to do that.
I can, if you're okay putting it out there.
I'm
Yes.
fine with that because the very last page of that in yellow is practical takeaways and tips for teachers from cognitive science, right? And so that's a hyperlink that anybody could access. And then in that document is a list of wild resources, the things that I've gone through, podcasts, and the great people that I've learned from. So my point is, if you load that there and people just go to the last page of the PowerPoint, and they click on the yellow text, they could read that, and then they'll see a link to a wealth of resources that is enough to get anybody started. I don't want teachers really now just scrambling like crazy, like what books should I read? Where do I go to learn more about this? I told you already, I am not the expert, but I've been through this and I've been frustrated with my own teaching. And these are the resources that I use that have completely changed my mindset as a teacher, but also changed how I teach in my classroom.
We could end the show right there. So that's pretty much perfect. Head to the show notes. You'll see a link to Dave's presentation and go to the very last slide, everybody, for some quick ideas or dive deeper with those resources, the books and the people we share, whatever you want to do. That's going to be it for episode 213. Dave, thank you so much for putting this together, for connecting with us, and for coming on today's episode.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyable, and I give Eric my best as well.
Will do.
Thanks for listening to the EdTech Throwdown. Do us a couple of favors. Subscribe to our podcast on any major podcast catcher such as Apple, Spotify, Amazon Podcasts, and Stitcher. Go over to YouTube, search the EdTech Throwdown, subscribe to the channel. You can connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The show's handle is EdTech Throwdown. You can connect with Geis at GeisGotTech, Nick at NickGotTech. You can write us an Apple Podcast review. You could tell your friends about www.edtechthrowdown.com. And lastly, go over and check out our friends over at the Teach Better Podcast Network, a network that we are so proudly involved with. Until next time, remember, go try some EdTech because we will do the research so you can teach your class.